Sri Lanka, the tragic story of a nation in crisis. On the 31st of March 2022, a public protest occurred in the vicinity of the home of the Sri Lankan President Gotabaya Rajapaksa. The protest marked frustration at the shortages of essential commodities, gas, medicines, fuel, and the grueling 10 to 13-hour power cuts imposed by a cash-strapped government with insufficient dollars to pay for imported fuel. The protesters were tear-gassed by police, and the government sought to nip public anger in the bud by imposing a countrywide curfew and a state of emergency. Over the weekend of the 1st to the 3rd of April, people took to the streets to demand the resignation of a corrupt and incompetent government. On the 9th of April, hundreds of protesters took over Gale Face Green, the urban park that abuts the Indian Ocean in the capital Colombo. Referred to as Gota Go Gama, or Gota Go Village, the protesters at Gale face mixed class, gender, ethnicity and profession. The availability of credit through increased global investment in emerging markets, and access to these capital markets as a middle-income country, enabled Sri Lankan governments to develop its bond market from 2013 onwards, with incentives that included tax breaks to creditors. Rather than investing in industry and diversified exports, successive Sri Lankan governments spent this borrowed money on projects which produced little yield. By May, the crisis and widespread protests had brought the Sri Lanka government, dominated by the Sri Lanka Podajana Paramuna, SLPP, or Sri Lanka People's Front, led by the Rajapaksas, to its knees. The main demand, however, that the president himself resign, went unheeded until a tumultuous storming of President's House and the Presidential Secretariat by unarmed protesters on the 9th of July forced Gotabaya Rajapaksa to flee the country, first to the Maldives and then to Singapore, resigning via email 5 days later. Under Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe, controversially elected through a secret parliamentary ballot with SLPP support, the Sri Lankan government is currently negotiating a bailout package with the IMF. China, which was once close to the Rajapaksa regime and owns 10% of Sri Lanka's debt, has so far kept to the sidelines. As the enormity of the crisis dawned on Sri Lankans, Gota Go Gama offered a ground for hope. These ethnic divisions were fostered during the years of British colonial rule and imbalances that the Sinhala majority sought to address in the post-colonial era, resulting in a bloody civil war fought between 1983 and 2009. At Gota Go Gama, the Sinhala Buddhist credentials of the Rajapaksas, which had long been their political currency, was no longer valid, and the Buddhist monks who had legitimized Sinhala hegemony were openly ridiculed. The message was clear: Sri Lankan youth would no longer be duped by divisive ethnic politics. Since the divide and rule policy of British colonialism ended with independence in 1948, Sri Lankan political parties have constituted themselves along ethnic lines. The Sinhalese have, so far, been drawn to mainstream parties such as the Sri Lanka Freedom Party, SLFP, the United National Party, UNP, and the SLPP of the Rajapaksas. Despite anti-Muslim racism, the mainly Sinhalese protesters at Gota Go Gama were welcomed by Muslims, who also want regime change. At the end of the fast each day, Colombo-based Muslims were seen at Gale Face sharing sweets and samosas with the protesters. Sri Lanka's Tamils were less visible, pointing to deeper historical wounds that are yet to heal. Aware of the need to unite all Sri Lankans and the importance of optics, the Gota Go Gama protesters did have slogans in Tamil, where before they would have been only in Sinhala. In turn, some Tamil-owned businesses in Colombo donated food and drink to Gota Go Gama. In the north and east, satyagrahas were held on specific days as decided by the Aragalaya, with shops and businesses closing in solidarity with the protests in the south. It is undeniable, however, that Tamil speakers and slogans at Gota Go Gama were markedly fewer than those in Sinhala. Gota Go Gama shows both the promise and the fault lines, the aspirations and the anxieties that cut across ethnic and social relations in Sri Lanka today. As the Aragalaya became more militant, culminating in the capture of state buildings and the burning on the 9th of July of Wickremesinghe's home, and as the new president sanctioned a fierce military crackdown on the few protesters remaining at Gale Face, the ideological and tactical differences within the protest movement have widened. A better understanding of the nexus of global capital, debt and sovereign vulnerabilities will be among its legacies. Improved ethnic relations in a country riven by historic divisions may not.